Kia ora koutou, ko Richard Smith tōku ingoa. My name's Richard Smith. I'm the Director of the Resilience National Science Challenge. Thank you for joining us this morning. It's a really special day today, actually. This is the final, the ultimate Resilience Challenge webinar, and it's a pleasure to have the team from one of our flagship projects, actually. I had the pleasure of witnessing the development of this work, and it's really been quite a significant contribution from the challenge, so really excited to hear from the team. I'm just going to settle us in and then do a little bit of housekeeping and then hand over to Ian for the rest of the presentation. Add the next slide, please. Ki mihi e te pō, rangahawa ta ao, kia iorangi, kia io whenua. Ki ne mata o te ariki, ki matanuku, ki matarangi. Ki reira koe I tāne te waiora, ko ngā mongaru, ko ngā awa parawhenua here utikitai ki a tangaro e. Ko koe, ko au, ko taua nei, whiti ao, whiti ora, ara mai te tauki, haumi e, hue, tai ki e.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Yeah, just a little bit of housekeeping in terms of Q&A. So if you, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the session, several presentations from each of the presenters for the session, and then a Q&A that Ian will facilitate. So if you've got any questions, just pop those into the chat as we go along. So I'll hand over now to Ian. Ian White's Professor of Environmental Planning and also recently taken on the role of Assistant Vice-Chancellor Impact at the University of Waikato. And Ian has been the project lead essentially for this aspect of work, and I'll hand over him now for the rest of the introductions. Kia ora, Ian.
Tēnā koe, Richard. Well, first of all, thanks so much for joining us. I know it's lunchtime and you've all got other things you could be doing, so really appreciate you joining us today. We're going to give about a quick 10 minutes each of me, Christina and Sarah of the research team. Unfortunately, Raven can't be with us today. She's unwell, but we'll quickly cover, I'll just name check some of the things that she's working on, and maybe hopefully she can catch up with more of that research at a later date. But before we start, I just wanted to thank the team. It's been a real pleasure working together on this. It's been, and watching the development of the team and watching us really function well together. And each one of us led one part of a project, and then the others could contribute and help. And it's just been a real pleasure. And I think that's been one of the great things of the Resilience Challenge, has been watching these new capacities and capabilities we've generated start to come through. And I think they're going to provide so much value over the next few decades. Next slide, please, Christina. Just to say, because I know we don't have too much time, I think this project, or this part of the wider Resilience Challenge, was really looking at the idea that change is difficult, and there's lots of factors which are trying to resist change and promote business as usual or the status quo or those kind of aspects. And so by recognizing that there's politics and power and agency at play, you can really look at different lenses to look at change and transformation, and recognize that change is actually risky, and lots of people like things how they are, and so looking to try and de-risk those difficult decisions. And so one of the things sort of we did was we looked at change occurring in different areas of which intersected with resilience. And the first of those I led, which was on COVID-19, recovering crisis policy making. And then Raven led the next one on politics and policy for impacted communities, including the disability community. And then Christina extended her work on managed retreat and into post-retreat and what comes next. And then Sarah had the tricky job of trying to tie it all together with, okay, we know this, now what? What can we do to try and make decisions differently, recognizing that some of these problems that we have. Okay, next slide, please. I just wanted to now if we just take a moment and pause to reflect on what 2019 and 2020 was like when the Resilience Challenge had just started, is that we had these grand ideas about what we'd quite like to do. And then within quite short order, we had a global pandemic. We had a live experiment in crises and recovery and transformation. And so it felt like if we don't research this, this is such a missed opportunity to understand lessons for the next crisis, which might come along. And so we did quite some significant work in the first year or two of this project around COVID-19 and crisis decision making, in particular infrastructure-led recovery and build back better and shovel ready projects and that kind of thing. And so there's three papers that I just want to highlight now, which exemplify what we did. I think for the first of them, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next sort of slide, but just to set the scene, if you remember when the shovel ready project hit, or when COVID-19 hit, we quickly announced the shovel ready projects fund, and then this was an opportunity to transform society. There was a call for lots of different ideas and projects, very infrastructure and quite capital intensive as recovery goes. But we wanted to follow the process of decision making rather than what projects were decided or not, to see to what extent the process of decision making transformed what was given the green light or not. And so we looked at press releases, media, official information requests, cabinet documents to sort of piece together the story of how decision making occurred under these processes of crisis and emergency, and recognizing that actually it was quite difficult for government. They did need to provide stimulus and they were under time pressured, and to try and work out, of all the hopes generated for change, which ones were privileged and why. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that project on the next slide, but the middle paper sort of extended this a little bit, because as we were developing this research, we realized it wasn't just us that was going through this these questions. And so I worked with academics in Australia and the UK, because all countries had adopted a Build Back Better infrastructure-led stimulus phrase. They all used shovel-ready projects, and they were all lots of promises to transform society to be more fairer, to address climate change and resilience and all that kind of aspect. So we looked at the comparisons and similarities between the two countries to get a broad sense of whether this strategy might work, and if not, why not. And that was it was an interesting project in terms of even though all the countries wanted to do a similar kind of approach and even set up similar processes which have very similar wording, you could see the politicians had looked at each other. In a sense, we didn't actually change society. We didn't build back better. I think there was a rising of the importance of infrastructure, but at the same time, so infrastructure was seen as absolutely critical for system transformation and recovery, but it was also seen as too important for politics, too important for people, and too important for planning. And so it was all about rapid investment rather than the right infrastructure for the right communities in the right place for the right purpose, and which might have needed a bit more time than they had. And so we didn't really build back better as much as build similar things with less democratic involvement. And this is, you see the fingerprints of that in some of the policy changes that have happened over the last few years as well. The last project, which was led by Christina, was actually looking at the extent to which we included blue or green infrastructure in our Build Back Better. So in all the projects that were submitted, was this sort of grey infrastructure, pipes, or was it green infrastructure? Were we looking at system change from what infrastructure is and what it can do? And we found that actually there was some good practice going on, and the signifiers of where that good practice happened were areas with good spatial planning. So areas that had a good long-term plan of what they wanted already had their ideas in place about what they needed to roll out when the crisis occurred. And areas which didn't or weren't in advance with spatial planning found they were much more reactive. So it was a real argument for spatial planning and also indigenous-led involvement in recovery, because there was an awful lot of the really good projects which were involving green infrastructure and nature did have a real indigenous sort of lens that it was applying to the change and resilience. But overall, it was quite disjointed, quite project level, and I think it overall it sort of felt like there's a lack of strategy going on in New Zealand about when the next crisis occurs. What do we need to roll out for whom? So, next slide, please, Christina. So, just to give you a bit more detail on the what we call the hope to disappointment paper. This is looking at the process of decision making for the shovel-ready projects and what kind of projects were favoured and why. So there was an awful lot of promise going on in the press and in the public domain when this happened. I'm sure lots of you remember there was a lot of claims for we should do this, we should do that. And we sort of pieced together and almost mapped the hopes from different groups about what they expected from this transformation. And then to see which hopes were raised by whom, and then to follow those hopes through the process of decision making to see which ones were privileged and why. And what we found out when we sort of started to follow the money, if you like, or follow the decision making, and this was actually quite technical, deep work. We had reams and reams of cabinet documents, official information requested, even find out some of what we thought was quite basic information. But the sort of headline news is there was 1,924 projects submitted, and 177 were presented to cabinet, 150 were funded. So the government and cabinet can say they retained decision-making power because they picked the 150, but the technical process actually narrowed down 1,900 projects to 177. So who really held the decision-making power or the opportunities for transformation? And it really put the lens on, we need to understand the KPIs that are set up about how selection of this occurs, because that was where the real power was. It wasn't actually within the cabinet meetings. Okay, next slide, please, Christina. So just to finish off, before I hand over, I think for the last few decades, researchers have really promoted the idea of crises as opportunity and inflection points for change. And I think what this research revealed about tracking where investment and where transformation occurred and why it may not have done in practice is that perhaps there's a little naivety there and the narratives that researchers have about this, because it didn't really occur. In some ways, it was a retrograde steps in some of our decision making and some of the investment that we've done. And crises do represent a break from normality, and they are an opportunity for change, but they're not just opportunities for us. They're opportunities for others with power and agency who might be promoting narratives about about how inefficient decision making is when you involve the public, or how you need technical approaches by expert panels rather than to go through consultation in the planning system. And so it's not just an opportunity for us, it's an opportunity for others too. And I think the key message that we saw is that it's a real mistake to rely on future crises to help us transform. We need to really look at the everyday politics here and do it within our spatial plans, our investment strategies, and our long-term plans, which embed this. So when change or crises do occur, they can be rolled out, because the processes of emergency tend to exclude a lot of the voices who might want transformation. And so I'll just pause there. And hand over to the next sort of speaker, which is going to be Christina, who's going to briefly introduce some of Raven's work before going to her own. So Kia ora.
Thank you, Ian. Tēnā koutou katoa. He pukinga o I te whare wānanga o Waikato ko Christina tōku ingoa. So my name's Christina and I'm a lecturer, senior lecturer here at the University of Waikato. It's been a real privilege to be a part of this research team and I've really enjoyed continuing this research and working with the research team across these different projects as well. It's been a great second phase of the Resilience Challenge. Unfortunately, Raven can't be here with us today, so I'm just wanting to flag this is one of her many research focus areas. This is a recent paper that just came out, so I thought I would just highlight that for you and show this paper in Kotuitui. It's open access, so you can access it just by searching the paper title or searching Raven's name on Google Scholar. And this research was looking at submissions made on our first draft National Adaptation Plan, looking at how climate adaptation is framed and imagined by different groups. And there's some really interesting findings there about the different ways in which we see our future as a country according to those submissions. And so, I'd really recommend you having a look at that. And in time, Raven will be able to disseminate more of her research findings on disability and other areas in this program. So we'll move along. So a lot of my research, my key sort of research focus in this project has been on planned retreats. And as we know, policy options for managing climate change and disasters are really focusing on planned retreats, partly because we haven't focused on them so much in the past and we've had a very mitigation based sort of system. So I've got this first slide up here to just bring you into the topic and start thinking about the ways in which myself and colleagues have been thinking about planned retreats for almost a decade now, sort of spanning the research across the program. And so what we're really wanting to sort of encourage when we're talking and thinking about planned retreats is that they're not just a physical relocation, but they're a practice of proactive and strategic adaptation, ideally. And those processes and the outcomes of planned retreats can create really material impacts on people and communities, local economies and ecologies, and so much more. There are complicated outcomes and processes. And I'm sure many of you who are either working in this space or potentially even affected by planned and managed retreats, you will know this already. But from the research and really understanding the various case studies globally and in Aotearoa, we know that there's a broad remit for what we mean when we're talking about planned retreats. And on the slide here, I've just sort of showing you some of the diverse ways in which the key drivers influence the outcome. So a lot of planned retreat that we talk about and when we're talking about within national boundaries, we're thinking about planned human and infrastructure retreats from disaster and climate risks. And so driven by the need to reduce risks to humans, to human life and to assets. But we also have the important thing to think about in terms of ecological retreat and migration as we are affected more and more by climate change and coastal squeeze. And so we can also have planned retreats that are driven for non-human reasons, for conservation reasons, or even I've seen examples internationally for offset, for infrastructure projects, or for mitigation reasons, for restoring land to sequester carbon. And then within those, they can overlap. We can have really strategic projects that kind of focus on a number of these drivers, as well as preserving relationships to land at the same time as retreating, redeveloping land following retreat, and thinking about the different ways that those retreat processes can occur. So recognizing that planned retreats are very diverse. They can attend to different needs, and so it's important to think of them as an umbrella term really when we're talking about it. And recognizing that retreat shouldn't be associated always with defeat. We frame it as the remaking of space, changing those unsustainable land use patterns and activities, recognizing that it's not just people and infrastructure, but also I like to include activities within the definition of retreats, probably because I come from a planning background, but also because we're thinking about things that people are doing not always permanently in these spaces. So that might be research activities or passive recreation happening in these spaces. We are often retreating those as well, those activities, not just people and assets and permanent things. So one of the key papers that is relevant to Aotearoa is a paper put out in 2022, Reimagining Relationships with Space, Place and Property, this one here, which we'll get to next. But in that paper, we looked at the history of planned or managed retreats in Aotearoa and looked at how that's evolved over time and how the practices have kind of influenced that policy development and I guess the role of managed retreat or planned retreat policy in the country and its evolution over time and where we are now. So looking at the past to see where we are now and where we're heading to the future. And then if you first start thinking about the history of planned retreats in Aotearoa, we know very well that Māori communities have traditional and contemporary knowledge of risk and hazard, and records oral history and some amazing work also done by Akuhata Bailey Winata has reconfirmed this, that a whole lot of practices from Māori communities illustrate really early disaster risk reduction practices and planned retreats. And those were by cultural restriction or avoidance of certain activities, tikanga-based resource management, and adaptive resettlement, often after disaster events. And Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga Māori demonstrate a really strong systems-based understanding of the environment, which really resonates with what we see as being a more holistic philosophy of planned and managed retreats, and also really highlights the value in Indigenous thinking and practice today. And then moving along this spectrum, of course, colonisation happened, and that really changed the nature of environmental management, understanding of different worldviews, and really reflects quite a haphazard history to managing and planning retreats, and also a totally different system of property ownership. And so we had these early reactive practices, which were indicative of what we are seeing today, formal policy mechanisms like buyouts, and some really isolated cases, which had the same debates around compensation and property loss that we're still dealing with today, from 1840 all the way through to the present. And over time, our policies have shifted in relation to how we practice managed retreats and how we imagine them, and which has also helped to legitimise them in policy. We have seen a gradual recognition of the fact that managed retreat is inevitable in some places. So the timeline that I've got up on the slide here really provides a summary of the evolution of the imaginaries of managed retreats in Aotearoa, and we can really see it as sort of a reactive to passive to proactive, ideally, timeline, where those Indigenous practices, of course, saw retreat from harm as being a very viable option, and we know it was occurring through a different worldview, but it was occurring in pre-colonisation to the onset of some more reactive responses in the wake of colonisation and disasters. But we have started to head towards policy that acknowledges the option, but also we have very little guidance or implementation support to deliver managed and planned retreats. And to the situation of today where we recognise that retreat is a really inevitable strategy in the face of increasing risk, but we're still waiting on that adaptation framework, and we're still waiting on that governance framework to really deliver it consistently and equitably across the country. So regulation has evolved really incrementally, and you can see some of the different policy experiments on this page and how they've contributed to this policy development over time. And so we've had an kind of ad hoc approach to policy development. We've had passive relocatable building regulations. We've had some control of hard protection measures to essentially require consideration of alternatives, property notifications to try and push the conversation to much more active forms of managed retreat, such as forced acquisition under the Public Works Act, extinguishment of existing use rights, and buyouts in a more voluntary manner. So we've had a gradual increase in the understanding and practice of actively controlling land use activities, and all the way through to much more, involved approaches and strategic approaches to retreats. The policy experiments really demonstrated testing of ideas over time and an opportunity for learning regarding the feasibility of policies and also the major challenges that we face. We know we've still got a lot of these challenges to address. And our research also really emphasises that while in a lot of ways quite a few of these policy experiments have been quite difficult and in some ways quite undesirable, they have provided a mechanism through which different imaginaries and different pathways of retreat have been seen as more politically and institutionally feasible, as well as providing these issue attention opportunities to really refocus on the fact that we need this national guidance, we need funding mechanisms, and we need an understanding of when we should retreat and how we work through those processes with communities in a collaborative way. But we know enduring resistance to plan and manage retreats recognises that we do have underdeveloped social legitimisation, and so we still have a long way to go in terms of that delivering upon, in some spaces, what is required. And so really the key goal and the key message that we look at in the end of this paper is that we need to move away from the single-use policy that we've seen in the past to strategic adaptation. More than just physical relocation, the philosophy of managed retreats demands that we reimagine and we remake spaces, and ultimately that we reform our relationships between people and place and the environment. Managed retreats represent a really relational challenge rather than being some new policy approach opposed to protection. It's really an opportunity to reimagine space, place, and property. And therefore, the ways that retreats are imagined need to move beyond the need for retreat and to consider how to remake space. And that really leads to the final piece of my work, which I don't yet have a slide on because it's about to be submitted, but looking globally at how we remake space post-retreat, how we rethink, reuse, and in some cases continue using land. And so, yeah, that's about on its way. I won't talk to that anymore, and I'll hand over to Sarah. So, yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. Kia ora koutou, Sarah Bevan, toko ingoa. I'm based at the University of Canterbury, so just wanted to echo what Christina and Ian have said. And I think for me, it's been a particular privilege because those guys would be working together anyway, whereas for me, I would probably not have had this opportunity if it wasn't for the challenge to work with this team. And it has been one of the highlights of my academic life, actually working with these guys. So, yeah. I am the co-director of the Disaster Risk and Resilience group at the University of Canterbury, and I have a background in social theory, which was quite useful when I came back into academia to look at the use of science, I guess, in disaster risk management in a general sense. So today I just wanted to talk about this work that we've been doing together, which has been a lot of fun and quite exciting. We were invited to partner through RNC and very early in policy development by a group of advisors. And so we agreed that we would use this to test a kind of safe space approach so that scientists could come together with policy advisors in a relatively safe space to share specialist knowledge. And this is at a very early stage in policy development. And so we worked together with them. And I should say at this point too that thanks so much to Richard and also Delia Tamsin, who were heavily involved in this right from the start. So it was quite a wide collaborative effort. We co-designed and jointly implemented workshops online. They were pandemic influenced, so that's partly why they had to be online. And then we did interviews with practitioners and the researchers who were involved. So today I can't give you much detail about that because we're still working on publications, but what I thought would be useful would be just to share a couple of the visualizations we used to focus the workshop discussions and to just share a couple of high-level findings and implications. So Christina, if you could jump into the next one, that would be great. Okay, great, thank you. So here I just wanted to thank Derek Gill for drawing my attention to this publication, which is from NZIER. And this comes from an article where I'm not sure, it's a report actually, I think, a working paper to be specific, where they synthesized findings around what made policy durable. So in other words, what kinds of policies lasted, didn't have to be constantly changed or removed or replaced. And they found that to be durable, policy had to be acceptable to the wider public, politically acceptable. It also had to be able to be done. So it had to work, and it had to work, sorry. So in other words, it had to be effective at addressing the policy problem it was set up to address. And so they represent this as three different lenses: political judgment, professional practice, and scientific evidence. And I think what I really love about this is that I'm very familiar with a lot of the theory in this space, but I haven't really come across another example where they distinguish between, where they sort of use a functional focus rather than a kind of community focus, which is more common. And normally the political and advisor or practitioner communities, so the elected MPs and policy advisors, are usually lumped together and just called policy makers. Whereas what's nice about this is it's not about the communities, it's about the functions. And you can see that even though probably any member of a policy or a political elected member or a practitioner or a scientist, any one of them could make a decision about whether or not something was politically feasible, possible, or effective. You can see that scientific communities are vastly better qualified to make that call in terms of scientifically credible, whereas politicians literally owe their positions to whether or not something is going to be accepted to the public. And practitioners are best placed to understand the institutional arrangements in place and whether or not a policy can be enacted. So those communities tend to line up with those three different functions. I'll just get Christina, can you just, yeah, great. So the point I guess I just wanted to make, and which we made in the workshops and which people found useful, was that those two communities, the policy advisors and the politicians, all of the government institutional structures are designed to bring them together so that they can make those calls together and they can agree whether things are acceptable and feasible. But they are not designed to routinely involve scientists. And so that's really where our workshops came in. It was an attempt to, do you want to click once more, Christina? Sorry, thanks. So they were an attempt to actually bring everyone together very early in policy development to help contribute in a way to a durable policy solution. So if we can go to the next slide. So the other graphic that I wanted to share with you was one that we used in our last workshop because we were all very interested, I think, in the issue of the secondary risks, so sort of political and professional risks that were associated with making decisions that were potentially unpopular or even unpopular with particular groups. And so we had this graphic which was, okay, let's say that you have as your policy goal developing a framework that will enable decision making to slow rising rates of vulnerability and exposure in high hazard locations. So that's your policy problem, is the rising rates of vulnerability and exposure, and what you're aiming for is policy decisions that will reduce that. So you have this kind of virtuous cycle where if those decisions are made, then that should reduce those rising rates and so on. The rising rates should drive decisions that reduce that risk. But Christina, if you could click once more, thank you. So what we wanted the people in the workshop to consider was these secondary risks and the way they can work to undermine the policy goal. So those secondary risks are the political and professional risks associated that making the right decision if you want to reduce risk, but that maybe carries a political risk or a professional risk. And that these risks basically push in the opposite direction. They make it less likely that people are going to make those decisions, and therefore they are like this silent secondary negative cycle that's happening behind the scenes that is inhibiting those other decisions, the decisions to reduce risk. So just that's all. Those are the two diagrams. We found them to be very helpful. A lot of the participants also commented on how much they liked the diagrams in terms of understanding what was going on in the workshops. So if we could shift to the last slide. Thanks, Christina. So I just wanted to share some findings here, and that there were many things that we found that were utterly in keeping with wider international findings about the fact that there's so many misalignments between the institutions in the broader sense, including sort of cultural norms and things like that, as well as drivers and the actual sort of harder, more formal institutional structures between science and policy communities. And our findings were utterly consistent with those. So I'm not going to talk about that today. I just wanted to talk about the three things that we found surprising and that aren't commonly, I haven't come across in the wider literature. And so the first one was that we used a non-disclosure agreement in our workshops for the benefit of practitioners, and we expected that practitioners would like that because it made them safer to share the early policy thinking without any risk of it getting into the public domain. What was a surprise was that the researchers in the project were also extremely positive about it, and many of them felt that it kind of reduced perceived risks to intellectual property. And this is a bit of a problem in New Zealand and around the world, where there's a real tendency, sometimes if people share their ideas or their findings before they've published them, then someone else will jump in and publish them instead. So they felt that this helped a lot in that space, which was unexpected. The other unexpected thing was that the practitioners were extremely positive about the wide range of expertise that we involved, and we deliberately brought in early career researchers and so on. So it was a range of sort of status as well as a range of knowledge. But actually the researchers were, for different reasons, were very mixed about that. So we found that really interesting, and we'll be publishing on that in more detail as well. And then the third thing was that where we had the workshop that focused specifically on the secondary risks, the practitioners were really enthusiastic about that, and in fact noticeably contributed very actively, much more than they had in the previous workshops, talked about that a lot. But the researchers were, again, really mixed, and there were some who felt really that they shouldn't be even kind of involved in that. It wasn't really their problem, I suppose, in some ways, and that they didn't have the expertise to think about it, which I thought was interesting, because one of the things you need when you bring communities together like that is that they're prepared to be open to the issues that the other side of the collaboration brings to the table. So that was also quite interesting. So we felt that those findings alone indicate we have a highly competitive national research environment still. We think that's why that to some extent influenced the attitudes to the NDA and the inclusive selection criteria. But also a lot of the comments from practitioners, they're really struggling with increasing pace of policy change. And they really need evidence. It's really hard for them to get hold of it. So this is partly why they were so pleased about that. So we felt that on both sides, there's a real appetite for measures that reduce the secondary risks associated with participation, and that applies to the research community as well as the policy community. And that was perhaps slightly more of a surprise to us. And then the other thing that we felt that these research findings showed, Christina, yeah, thank you, was that we really need something a bit more structural, we felt, that would help to provide policymakers with access to specialist knowledge that was a bit more open than the sort of arrangement where hand-picked specialist sort of senior experts are brought in to quietly chat, or you have a consultant hired to actually do some focused research. We felt that some kind of virtual research centre where you had an institutional arrangement that really enhances evidence, the provision of evidence and access to the researchers who are working on the particular issues that are being addressed through policy. We felt that really had the potential to enhance that while also reducing the secondary risks. So that's really all I had to say about that. I think hopefully that still leaves some time for questions. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Okay, I think that's over to me now for questions. So if you do have any questions, put them in the chat. But I'll work through the ones we've got. The first one's from Heather Roberts, and I think it's for you, Christina. In regards to the terminology of retreat, I've heard planned relocation and managed relocation as opposed to retreat. Retreat having its emotive connotations, and interested to hear the reason managed retreat was used in the research papers. And I think maybe also talk about how you actually also argued against it with managed retreats and your one-woman campaign for that to sort of enter into the policy lexicon.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Heather. That's a really important question, and it's a bit of a tricky one. It depends on the context that we're talking about. I think that the wording is really important in the academic context, and for the purpose of searching for terms in the policy sphere. Looking at the historical use of the term, managed retreat has been the predominant term, and so for purposes of consistency in academic papers, so people can find what we're talking about, there's been a strong push for us to stick with managed retreat. There's been some movement in broader disaster mobility literature to use planned relocation, planned retreat, internal migration, and then looking at the broader disaster risk reduction terms on things like so I'm just lost the word now. We're essentially the other mobility terms. There's a whole range of different terms that can be used. So we use managed retreat for consistency in terms of the policy terminology, but recognise that the wording is really important when we're talking with communities around finding something that is more applicable to that context. So it might be something that councils or governments are looking, like the working group on community-based relocation or collaborative relocation, depending on how they're approaching it, because of those negative connotations. In the UK, they use managed realignment because of the problems with managed retreat. And so I think, and especially for Māori communities, managed retreat has a whole lot of problems in terms of that the word managed and retreat as well from a military perspective too. And so I think it depends on the context. The reason we used it in our academic papers as managed retreat was in alignment with those terms, those SITCH terms, and that expectation from the academics. There's been some recent papers on this, that we need to keep the terminology consistent so that we can actually keep on track of all the research that's happening in that space, but recognise that there might be other more appropriate terms and sort of using those as keywords throughout. So it's to keep that string of research connection there, but I think absolutely for when we're actually dealing with it on the ground, it's an important part of the puzzle in terms of deciding on the appropriate terms. And the fact that managed retreat is so variable means that the wording might be different in different circumstances. And so where you're dealing with a slow land use change over time, it might just be land use change. Or it might be that you are dealing with, active community-driven relocation, and that term might be more appropriate. And it might be more appropriate for communities to determine those terms themselves. But yeah, it's a really important aspect of the issue, but we do try to stick with, and I've moved more to planned retreat because of the negative connotations with managed when I'm generally saying the word, but yeah, there are so many options that we do definitely need to think about that more deeply.
Okay, thanks, Christina. And next one's for you, Sarah, and it's from Kushla. Interesting concept around political and professional risk being increasing, which is increasing risk. Most politicians will say they're making decisions that reduce risk for communities, rates increases, for example. I guess it depends on what we mean by risk to whom and what, and which bring into the question of the trade-offs required in decision making. Is your research looking into this?
Hi, thank you. Great question, Kushla. That probably means I haven't been clear enough in my diagram about what I meant in that diagram. So I think that that in terms of the risks that we were looking at, in the first instance, it was definitely, there was the risk that is posed, for example, by hazards to communities that are in harm's way. then and so what we were arguing there was that decisions, let's say, just by way of example, what Christina's talking about, a decision to have a planned retreat from an area that's going to go underwater in a flood or something like that, or from a coastal retreat, that is a decision that reduces harm, and so therefore reduces the risk and the rising rates of risk. Whereas the secondary risks we're talking about are risks to decision makers specifically. So those secondary risks are inclined to push or drive a reluctance to make decisions that might incur professional or personal risks. And I think, I don't know, but we had a chat really early on, Ian and I, about this, and said that we both heard people talking about career-ending decisions. So that's the kind of thing that we were concerned about. Does that make that clear? We're not, that's really what we have been looking into. So it's not so much risk in general as specific lots of risk there.
Thanks, Sarah. There's another one, next one from Reagan, which looks like it's going back your way, Christina.
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah.
Yep, I can answer that question about how Māori communities are meaningfully involved.
Yes.
Yeah, really important question. And I think as a tangata tiriti, I wouldn't like to speak specifically on that about how Māori should be involved, but I would like to point you to the Working Group on Managed Retreat report. First of all, stating that I think tino rangatiratanga is vital in this space for Māori. And I think that the working group had looked at a separate process for planned retreat and with a specific Māori term as well, avoiding that terminology. And some of the key things in the report, I just got that up to reflect on, is the status of Māori land as taonga tuku iho, the special rules that obviously apply under the Te Ture Whenua Māori Act in relation to retention and productive use of land, managing that, recognising that also in giving effect to Te Tiriti, retreat may not be appropriate, protection actually may be more important, and that retreat is not necessarily inevitable for Māori land as it might be for other land. Recognising the challenges associated with multiple ownership and management structures for Māori land, and of course recognising things like cultural infrastructure, marae, urupa, and thinking about customary rights and interests as well in spaces that where retreats happening, where those might be impinged upon, and things like customary marine title under the Taku Tai Moana Act. So I think there's a whole range of things that need to be considered, and I think there are Māori researchers in this space who are working and actively supporting the adaptation framework process. So yeah, I don't want to speak too much on that, but I think we certainly think, tino rangatiratanga is must be central in these decision-making processes.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And just to name check the work of Akawatu Wyniot Bailey as well, who's just finishing his PhD, he's my PhD student, who's just leading a lot of the discussions on this and doing some brilliant science. He's going to have a great future. We need to have a specific seminar just on this, I think. And just to share it around a little and give Christina and Sarah a little break, I just sort of scan down and get one from me while you can just have a quick drink. So Mark Trudinger, I was curious about the use of the term build back better. Well, this had its origin in disaster risk reduction. It's rarely used today in the field of disaster recovery. Christina and Wes documented this in appropriation of the term in the US COVID response. Is your use of the term due to a similar use by government here in Aotearoa, or were there other reasons? Exactly that. So I know Christina really well, and we were chatting because we're all COVID researchers researching similar areas. So we researched the term because it was the term used by governments. I don't like the term personally, and I think it's one of those things that raises more questions than it answers. Build back better, when, for whom, how? who has agency and power, and it feels like it needs much deeper interrogation, but it's quite persuasive in the political sphere. So we used it because that was the used term used by governments, really. Okay, I'll go back up to another one. So maybe this is one for everyone who wants to chip in. This is Chris Cameron. There seems to be an inherent tension between the need for urgency transformation and the need for iwi or community participation. Is there any answers for this? I might start, and then if others want to jump in. When emergencies happen, there's a natural tendency to want to recover and to recover normality and bounce back. And you want to do that quickly. You want normality to be restored as soon as possible. And so sometimes there isn't space in that short term for community involvement. But what that means is that you need to do it in advance of the next disaster. That's the answer, which means you need to have good spatial plans that show the kind of futures community want in particular locations and the kind of investment they want for whom and why. And that's the real answer to urgency and transformation, because of course we're going to want to make decisions quickly. Christina or Sarah, is there anything you wanted to add?
I just wanted to talk all that. I think, we need to think, and that's what I was talking about with the managed retreat, where we need to go from thinking just about retreat to strategic adaptation. These things need to fit together. We need to be thinking ahead of time. Yes, we have to react to these events as they happen, but we also need to be getting ahead of that. It's about time we get these national guidance and these mechanisms in place, because these things are only going to become more and more important.
Okay.
I just want to say that as well. And I think also there's some quite interesting work around what happens to, there's an effective time compression after big disasters that causes that urgency, and that is very destructive to ongoing constructive decision making, and as Ian says, is vastly more effective if recovery planning has been put in place beforehand. And in New Zealand, we unfortunately have had a tradition of this idea that we can use ODESK to come together and just do this kind of adaptive sudden decision making in response to big disasters, and that is really of real concern, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw it to a close there, because I'm going to have to hand back to Richard, who wants to say few final words. It's the final Resilience Challenge webinar. But thanks so much for your questions. We might try and work through them. And I don't know what the normal practice is, whether we email or anything, but some great questions coming in there as well. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Ian. And thanks to Christina and Sarah and Raven in absentia for the presentations today, and to all of the great engagement, the fantastic set of questions there. And to Ian's point, for those that we haven't got to, what we usually try and do is compile those up and get back in slower time around any kind of shared or kind of high-level themes, I guess. And a recording will be available through our normal channels in due course. So thank you to the team for the presentation this morning. This is the final, the ultimate Resilience Challenge webinar. So it is kind of an interesting day, some mixed emotions, I guess, around that for everybody. It's been really heartening to see the level of engagement, especially just in the last 18 months or so, probably culminating with our big symposium at Te Papa just a few weeks ago now, Te Tai Whanaki, and really kind of encouraged by the level of interest in dialogue and the desire to kind of get together, share knowledge, and to pursue solutions around these really significant challenges. So thank you to the RNC crew behind the scenes for today's webinar, Jenny in particular, who kind of keeps all the wires plugged into the right spaces, which is a bigger job than it should be. And she's kept it all going, which is fantastic. Thank you all for your attention today and the support over the last 10 years, really. So, ka nui tēnei, that's it for now. I'll just kind of close us out. But in terms of future opportunities. So just keep an eye on the Resilience Challenge website for now. There are some emerging opportunities, the establishment of a new platform. We don't know how that's all going to come together, but it's exciting that we've got a pathway to take aspects of this work forward. Kia whakaere te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Noho ora mai rā, enjoy your day. Thanks a lot, everyone. Ka kite.